Maine. On the river, where was a packed trail and where snowshoes were unnecessary, the dogs averaged 6 miles an hour. To keep up with them, the two men were compelled to run. Daylight and Karma relieved each other regularly at the gee pole, for here was the hard work of steering the flying sled and of keeping in advance of it. The man relieved dropped behind the sled, occasionally leaping upon it and resting. It was severe work, but of the sort that was exhilarating. They were flying, getting over the ground, making the most of the packed trail. Later on, they would come to the unbroken trail, where 3 miles an hour would constitute good going. Then there would be no riding and resting and no running. Then the gee pole would be the easier task, and a man would come back to it to rest after having completed his spell to the fore, breaking trail with the snowshoes for the dogs. Such work was far from exhilarating also. They must expect places where for miles at a time they must toil over chaotic ice jams, where they would be fortunate if they made 2 miles an hour. And there would be the inevitable bad jams, short ones, it was true, but so bad that 1 mile an hour would require terrific effort. Kama and Daylight did not talk. In the nature of the work they could not, nor in their own natures were they given to talking while they worked. At rare intervals, when necessary, they addressed each other in monosyllables, Kama, for the most part, contenting himself with grunts. Occasionally a dog whined or snarled, but in the main the team kept silent. Only could be heard the sharp, jarring grate of the steel runners over the hard surface and the creak of the straining sled. As if through a wall, Daylight had passed from the hum and roar of the Tivoli into another world, a world of silence and immobility. Nothing stirred. The Yukon slept under a coat of ice 3 feet thick. No breath of wind blew, nor did the sap move in the hearts of the spruce trees that forested the river banks on either hand. The trees, burdened with the last infinitesimal pennyweight of snow their branches could hold, stood in absolute petrification. The slightest tremor would have dislodged the snow, and no snow was dislodged. The sled was the one point of life and motion in the midst of the solemn quietude, and the harsh churn of its runners but emphasized the silence through which it moved. It was a dead world, and furthermore a gray world. The weather was sharp and clear. There was no moisture in the atmosphere, no fog nor haze, yet the sky was a gray pall. The reason for this was that though there was no cloud in the sky to dim the brightness of day, there was no sun to give brightness. Far to the south the sun climbed steadily to meridian, but between it and the frozen Yukon intervened the bulge of the earth. The Yukon lay in a night shadow, and the day itself was in reality a long twilight. At 12:15, where a wide bend of the river gave a long vista south, the sun showed its upper rim above the skyline. But it did not rise perpendicularly. Instead, it rose on a slant, so by high noon it had barely lifted its lower rim clear of the horizon. It was a dim, wan sun. There was no heat to its rays, and a man could gaze squarely into the full orb of it without hurt to his eyes. No sooner had it reached meridian than it began its slant back beneath the horizon, and at 12:15 the earth threw its shadow again over the land. The men and dogs raced on. Daylight and Kama were both savages so far as their stomachs were concerned. They could eat irregularly in time and quantity, gorging hugely on occasion, and on occasion going long stretches without eating at all. As for the dogs, they ate but once a day, and then rarely did they receive more than a pound each of dried fish. They were ravenously hungry, and at the same time splendidly in condition. Like the wolves, their forebears, their nutritive processes were rigidly economical and perfect. There was no waste. The least particle of what they consumed was transformed into energy. And Kama and Daylight were like them. Descended themselves from the generation that had endured, they too endured. Theirs was the simple, elemental economy. A little food equipped them with prodigious energy. Nothing was lost. A man of soft civilization, sitting at a desk, would have grown lean and woebegone on the fare that kept Kama and Daylight at the top notch of physical efficiency. They knew, as the man at the desk never knows, what it is to be normally hungry all the time, so that they could eat any time. Their appetites were always with them and on edge, so that they bit voraciously into whatever offered, and with an entire innocence of indigestion. By 3 in the afternoon, the long twilight faded into night. The stars came out, very near and sharp and bright, and by their light dogs and men still kept the trail. They were indefatigable. And this was no record run of a single day, but the first day of 60 such days. Though Daylight had passed a night without sleep, a night of dancing and carouse, it seemed to have left no effect. For this there were 2 explanations. First, his remarkable vitality, and next, the fact that such nights were rare in his experience. Again enters the man at the desk, whose physical efficiency would be more hurt by a cup of coffee at bedtime than Daylight's by a whole night long of strong drink and excitement. Daylight traveled without a watch, feeling the passage of time and largely estimating it by subconscious processes. By what he considered must be 6 o'clock, he began looking for a camping place. The trail at a bend plunged out across the river. Not having found a likely spot, they held on for the opposite bank, a mile away. But midway they encountered an ice jam, which took an hour of heavy work to cross. At last Daylight glimpsed what he was looking for. A dead tree close by the bank. The sled was run in and up. Kama grunted with satisfaction, and the work of making camp was begun. The division of labor was excellent. Each man knew what he must do. With one axe, Daylight chopped down the dead pine. Kama, with a snowshoe and the other axe, cleared away 2 feet of snow above the Yukon ice and chopped a supply of ice for cooking purposes. A piece of dry birch bark started the fire, and Daylight went ahead with the cooking while the Indian unloaded the sled and fed the dogs their ration of dried fish. The food sacks he slung high in the trees beyond the leaping reach of the huskies. Next, he chopped down a young spruce tree and trimmed off the boughs. Close to the fire, he trampled down the soft snow and covered the packed space with the boughs. On this flooring he tossed his own and Daylight's gear bags, containing dry socks and underwear and their sleeping robes. Kama, however, had 2 robes of rabbit skin to Daylight's 1. They worked on steadily, without speaking, losing no time. Each did whatever was needed, without thought of leaving to the other the least task that presented itself to hand. Thus Kama saw when more ice was needed, and went and got it, while a snowshoe, pushed over by the lunge of a dog, was stuck on end again by Daylight. While coffee was boiling, bacon frying, and flapjacks were being mixed, Daylight found time to put on a big pot of beans. Kama came back, sat down on the edge of the spruce boughs, and in the interval of waiting, mended harnesses. "I think that Skookum and Booga make 'em plenty fight, maybe," Kama remarked, as they sat down to eat. "Keep an eye on them," was Daylight's answer. And this was their sole conversation throughout the meal. Once, with a muttered imprecation, Kama leaped away, a stick of firewood in hand, and clubbed apart a tangle of fighting dogs. Daylight, between mouthfuls, fed chunks of ice into the tin pot, where it thawed into water. The meal finished, Kama replenished the fire, cut more wood for the morning, and returned to the spruce bough bed and his harness mending. Daylight cut up generous chunks of bacon and dropped them in the pot of bubbling beans. The moccasins of both men were wet, and this in spite of the intense cold. So when there was no further need for them to leave the oasis of spruce boughs, they took off their moccasins and hung them on short sticks to dry before the fire, turning them about from time to time. When the beans were finally cooked, Daylight ran part of them into a bag of flour sacking 1.5 feet long and 3 inches in diameter. This he then laid on the snow to freeze. The remainder of the beans were left in the pot for breakfast. It was past 9 o'clock, and they were ready for bed. The squabbling and bickering among the dogs had long since died down, and the weary animals were curled in the snow, each with his feet and nose bunched together and covered by his wolf's brush of a tail. Kama spread his sleeping furs and lighted his pipe. Daylight rolled a brown paper cigarette, and the second conversation of the evening took place. "I think we come near 60 miles," said Daylight. "I think so," said Kama. They rolled into their robes, all standing, each with a woolen mackinaw jacket on in place of the parkas they had worn all day. Swiftly, almost on the instant, they closed their eyes. They were asleep. The stars leaped and danced in the frosty air, and overhead the colored bars of the aurora borealis were shooting like great searchlights. In the darkness, Daylight awoke and roused Kama. Though the aurora still flamed, another day had begun. Warmed over flapjacks, warmed over beans, fried bacon, and coffee composed the breakfast. The dogs got nothing, though they watched with wistful mien from a distance, sitting up in the snow, their tails curled around their paws. Occasionally they lifted one forepaw or the other, with a restless movement, as if the frost tingled in their feet. It was bitter cold, at least 65 below zero, and when Kama harnessed the dogs with naked hands, he was compelled several times to go over to the fire and warm the numbing finger-tips. Together the two men loaded and lashed the sled. They warmed their hands for the last time, pulled on their mittens, and mushed the dogs over the bank and down to the river trail. According to Daylight's estimate, it was around 7 o'clock, but the stars danced just as brilliantly, and faint, luminous streaks of greenish aurora still pulsed overhead. 2 hours later, it became suddenly dark, so dark that they kept to the trail largely by instinct. and Daylight knew that his time estimate had been right. It was a darkness before dawn, never anywhere more conspicuous than on the Alaskan winter trail. Slowly, the gray light came stealing through the gloom, imperceptibly at first, so that it was almost with surprise that they noticed the vague loom of the trail underfoot. Next, they were able to see the wheel dog, and then the whole string of running dogs and snow stretches on either side. Then the near bank loomed for a moment and was gone, loomed a second time and remained. In a few minutes the far bank, a mile away, unobtrusively came into view, and ahead and behind, the whole frozen river could be seen, with off to the left a wide, extending range of sharp-cut, snow-covered mountains. And that was all. No sun arose. The gray light remained gray. Once during the day a lynx leaped lightly across the trail, under the very nose of the lead dog, and vanished in the white woods. The dog's wild impulses roused. They raised the hunting cry of the pack, surged against their collars, and swerved aside in pursuit. Daylight, yelling "Whoa!" struggled with the gee pole and managed to overturn the sled into the soft snow. The dogs gave up. The sled was righted, and 5 minutes later they were flying along the hard-packed trail again. The lynx was the only sign of life they had seen in 2 days, and it, leaping velvet-footed and vanishing, had been more like an apparition. At 12 o'clock, when the sun peeped over the earth bulge, they stopped and built a small fire on the ice. Daylight, with the axe, chopped off chunks of the frozen sausage of beans. These, thawed and warmed in the frying pan, constituted their meal. They had no coffee. He did not believe in the burning of daylight for such a luxury. The dogs stopped wrangling with one another and looked on wistfully. Only at night did they get their pound of fish. In the meantime, they worked. The cold snap continued. Only men of iron kept the trail at such low temperatures, and Kama and Daylight were picked men of their races. But Kama knew the other was the better man, and thus, at the start, he was himself foredoomed to defeat. Not that he slackened his effort or willingness by the slightest conscious degree, but that he was beaten by the burden he carried in his mind. His attitude toward Daylight was worshipful. Stoical, taciturn, proud of his physical prowess, he found all these qualities incarnated in his white companion. Here was the one that excelled in the things worth excelling in, a man god ready to hand, and Kama could not but worship. Withal, he gave no sign of it. No wonder the race of white men conquered, was his thought, when it bred men like this man. What chance had the Indian against such a dogged, enduring breed? Even the Indians did not travel at such low temperatures, and theirs was the wisdom of thousands of generations. Yet here was this Daylight from the soft Southland, harder than they, laughing at their fears and swinging along the trail 10 and 12 hours a day. And this Daylight thought that he could keep up a day's pace of 33 miles for 60 days. Wait till a fresh fall of snow came down, or they struck the unbroken trail or the rotten rim ice that fringed open water. In the meantime, Kama kept the pace, never grumbling, never shirking. 65 degrees below zero is very cold. Since water freezes at 32 above, 65 below meant 97 degrees below freezing point. Some idea of the significance of this may be gained by conceiving of an equal difference of temperature in the opposite direction. 129 on the thermometer constitutes a very hot day. Yet such a temperature is but 97 degrees above freezing. Double this difference, and possibly some slight conception may be gained from the cold through which Kama and Daylight traveled between dark and dark and through the dark. Kama froze the skin on his cheekbones, despite frequent rubbings, and the flesh turned black and sore. Also, he slightly froze the edges of his lung tissue, a dangerous thing, and the basic reason why a man should not unduly exert himself in the open at 65 below. But Kama never complained, and Daylight was a furnace of heat, sleeping as warmly under his 6 pounds of rabbit skin as the other did under 12 pounds. On the second night, 50 more miles to the good, they camped in the vicinity of the boundary between Alaska and the Northwest Territory. The rest of the journey, save the last short stretch to DA, would be traveled on Canadian territory. With the hard trail and in the absence of fresh snow, Daylight had planned to make the camp 40 Mile on the fourth night. He told Kama as much, but on the third day the temperature began to rise. They knew snow was not far off, for on the Yukon it must get warm in order to snow. Also on this day they encountered 10 miles of chaotic ice jams, where 1,000 times they lifted the loaded sled over the huge cakes by the strength of their arms and lowered it down again. Here the dogs were well nigh useless, and both they and the men were tired excessively by the roughness of the way. An hour's extra running that night caught up only part of the lost time. In the morning they awoke to find 10 inches of snow on their robes. The dogs were buried under it and were loath to leave their comfortable nests. This new snow meant hard going. The sled runners would not slide over it so well, while one of the men must go in advance of the dogs and pack it down with snowshoes so that they should not wallow. Quite different was it from the ordinary snow known to those of the Southland. It was hard and fine and dry. It was more like sugar. Kick it, and it flew with a hissing noise like sand. There was no cohesion among the particles, and it could not be molded into snowballs. It was not composed of flakes, but of crystals, tiny geometrical frost crystals. In truth, it was not snow, but frost. The weather was warm as well, barely 20 below, and the two men, with raised ear flaps and dangling mittens, sweated as they toiled. They failed to make 40 Mile that night, and when they passed that camp next day, Daylight paused only long enough to get the mail and additional grub. On the afternoon of the following day, they camped at the mouth of the Klondike River. Not a soul had they encountered since 40 Mile, and they had made their own trail. As yet that winter, no one had traveled the river south of 40 Mile, and that, for the matter, the whole winter through they might be the only ones to travel it. In that day the Yukon was a lonely land. Between the Klondike River and salt water at DA intervened 600 miles of snow-covered wilderness, and in all that distance there were but 2 places where Daylight might look forward to meeting men. Both were isolated trading posts, 60 Mile and Fort Selkirk. In the summertime, Indians might be met at the mouths of the Stewart and White Rivers, at the Big and Little Salmons and on Lake Le Barge. But in the winter, as he well knew, they would be on the trail of the moose herds, following them back into the mountains. That night, camped at the mouth of the Klondike, Daylight did not turn in when the evening's work was done. Had a white man been present, Daylight would have remarked that he felt his hunch working. As it was, he tied on his snowshoes, left the dogs curl in the snow, and Kama, breathing heavily under his rabbit skins, and climbed up to the big flat above the high earth bank. But the spruce trees were too thick for an outlook, and he threaded his way across the flat and up the first steep slopes of the mountain at the back. Here, flowing in from the east at right angles, he could see the Klondike, and bending grandly from the south, the Yukon. To the left and downstream, toward Moosehide Mountain, the huge splash of white from which it took its name, showing clearly in the starlight. Lieutenant Schwatka had given it its name, but he, Daylight, had first seen it long before that intrepid explorer had crossed the Chilcoot and rafted down the Yukon. But the mountain received only passing notice. Daylight's interest was centered in the big flat itself, with deep water along its edge for steamboat landings. A sure enough likely town site, he muttered. Room for a camp of 40,000 men. All that's needed is the gold strike. He meditated for a space. $10 a pan'll do it, and it'll be the firedest stampede Alaska ever seen. And if it don't come here, it'll come somewhere hereabouts. It's a sure good idea to keep an eye out for town sites all the way up. He stood a while longer, gazing out over the lonely flat and visioning with constructive imagination the scene if the stampede did come. In fancy, he placed the sawmills, the big trading stores, the saloons and dance halls, and the long streets of miners' cabins. And along those streets he saw thousands of men passing up and down, while before the stores were the heavy freighting sleds with long strings of dogs attached. Also, he saw the heavy freighters pulling down the main street and heading up the frozen Klondike toward the imagined somewhere where the diggings must be located. He laughed and shook the vision from his eyes, descended to the level, and crossed the flat to camp. 5 minutes after he had rolled up in his robe, he opened his eyes and sat up, amazed that he was not already asleep. He glanced at the Indian sleeping beside him, at the embers of the dying fire, at the 5 dogs beyond, with their wolf's brushes curled over their noses, and at the 4 snowshoes standing upright in the snow. It's sure hell the way that hunch works on me, he murmured. His mind reverted to the poker game. 4 kings, he grinned reminiscently. That was a hunch. He lay down again, pulled the edge of the robe around his neck and over his ear flaps, closed his eyes, and this time fell asleep. End of Part 1, Chapter 4.